My name is Helen Calloway, and I am 72 years old. My hands, you see, they tell the whole story. They are maps of a life lived, marked by the fine lines of time and the swollen knuckles of arthritis. But they still know their purpose. They know the feel of cotton thread pulling through taut fabric, the whisper of a needle piercing a new patch. Here in my rocking chair, by the window overlooking the hazy Charleston mornings, I practice the art my mother taught me, and her mother taught her. I am a quilter. To me, it is a sacred language, a way to stitch together the past and the present. To my family, it's just what keeps the old lady busy. The air in my apartment is a permanent blend of salt marsh from the harbor and the crisp, clean scent of spray starch. It's a smell of comfort, of routine. The gulls cry their lonely song in the distance as I sip my morning tea, the steam warming my face against the Carolina humidity that seeps through the old window frames. My world is contained within these walls, decorated not with store-bought art, but with the tapestries of my own making. Dish towels with intricate dogwood patterns, a tablecloth that tells the story of 4 seasons, curtains that filter the morning light through a mosaic of colored fabrics. It is a life of quiet, deliberate beauty. Last Christmas Eve, this quiet was meant to be broken by joy. I'd spent 2 days preparing a feast, the kind you only make when you have people to share it with. The turkey was roasted to a perfect golden brown, its aroma filling every corner of the apartment. The stuffing was savory with sage and thyme. The pumpkin pie sat cooling on the counter, its crust flaky and buttery. The dining table, usually a place for my fabrics and threads, was set for 4, centered with my finest work. A quilted runner depicting a winter scene that had taken me 3 months of painstaking work to complete. Every stitch was a prayer for their arrival, but the doorbell never rang. The silence in the apartment grew heavy, thick with the smell of food that would go uneaten. My phone buzzed once on the kitchen counter, a harsh electronic sound that cut through the stillness. It was a text from my son, Mark. Mom. A last-minute deal to Aspen popped up. Too good to pass up. We'll make it up to you. Merry Christmas. Just like that. No call, no apology. Just a brief, sterile message. They hadn't just canceled. They had replaced me with something they considered a better offer. The beautiful table, the empty chairs, the silent phone. That was the moment I understood I wasn't a person to them anymore. I was an obligation they could easily reschedule. That night was the start of a new kind of silence. A year has passed since then, a year filled with the echoes of that abandonment. The promise to make it up to me dissolved into a series of flimsy excuses and hurried phone calls that always ended with them needing to rush off. Work is crazy, Mom. Alex has a soccer tournament. Susan isn't feeling well. The reasons changed, but the message remained the same. I was not a priority. I was a box to be checked off, a duty to be performed at their convenience. And they were perpetually, conveniently, out of time. They still don't understand what they did. My son, Mark, is an architect. He sees the world in blueprints and bottom lines, in structures of steel and glass. He looks at my quilts, at the intricate, hand-stitched patterns, and sees only wasted time. He sees fragility, not strength. His wife, Susan, is no different. She glides into my home with a polite, strained smile, her expensive, modern perfume doing battle with the familiar scent of my apartment. She calls my work charming and a nice little hobby, her voice laced with a condescension so fine it could pass through the eye of a needle. Their visits, when they happened, were brief and superficial. They'd sit on the edge of my sofa, as if afraid to get too comfortable, to let this old-fashioned world touch them too deeply. Alex, my grandson, would remain glued to his phone, the blue light of the screen reflecting in his glasses, a digital wall between us. I once tried to show him the log cabin pattern, explaining how each strip of fabric represented a log in the wall, the red center square symbolizing the hearth, the heart of the home. He just grunted, his thumbs flying across the screen, building some other world I wasn't a part of. The phone rang this morning, startling me. It was Mark. His voice was brisk, all business. There was no, "How are you, Mom?" Just a quick preamble before he got to the point. He needed me to look for some old property documents, something to do with the deed to this historic apartment building. He said it was just for his records, a formality. But after a year of near-total silence, a call about paperwork felt less like a request and more like a demand. He cleared his throat, and the reason for his call after all this time felt like a stone dropping in a quiet well. After we hung up, I sat in the silence, the receiver still cool in my hand. It was never about me. It was always about something they needed. A signature, a document, a babysitter in a pinch years ago. I was a resource, a piece of their past they had to manage. The pain of that realization was a dull, familiar ache, much like the arthritis in my hands on a damp morning. I looked down at the quilt in my lap, a kaleidoscope of blues and greens. I was in the middle of a storm at sea pattern, and the irony was not lost on me. My own quiet life felt like it was on the verge of a squall. This quilt, the one I am working on now, is different. It's more ambitious, more complex than anything I've attempted before. The pattern requires a mathematical precision that even Mark, with his blueprints, might appreciate if he ever bothered to look. Each tiny diamond of fabric must be cut and stitched with absolute accuracy, or the entire design will warp and fail. It's a challenge, a testament to the skill they so easily dismiss. While they see a woman fading away, my hands are building worlds, creating order out of chaos, one stitch at a time. It is my silent rebellion. I remember Susan's last visit, a few months ago. She'd picked up one of my quilting magazines from the side table, flipping through it with a detached air. "I just don't see how you have the patience for this, Helen," she'd said, her tone implying it was a lack of anything better to do. All these little pieces. She couldn't see the architecture in it, the engineering of color and shape. She couldn't see the stories embedded in the fabrics, a piece from my wedding dress, a scrap from Alex's baby blanket, a swatch from my mother's favorite apron. It wasn't just a hobby, it was my history. The ache in my knuckles is a constant companion. Some days it is a whisper of discomfort, other days a sharp, insistent burn. But I work through it. The repetitive motion of the needle, the gentle pull of the thread, becomes a kind of meditation, a way to focus beyond the pain, both physical and emotional. My doctor tells me I should rest my hands, but he doesn't understand. To stop quilting would be to surrender. It would be admitting that they are right, that I am just a frail old woman whose best days are behind her. My hands may be old, but they can still create things of beauty and permanence. I often think about legacy. Mark is building his with towers of concrete and steel that will scrape the Charleston sky. His name will be on plaques, his designs studied in schools. He believes he is building for the future. What he doesn't realize is that legacy isn't always measured in height or square footage. Sometimes, it's measured in the warmth a quilt provides on a cold night, in the history held within its threads, in the love that is stitched into every single seam. It's a softer, quieter legacy, but one that endures just the same. The loneliness is the hardest part. It's not the being alone that hurts. I've always been comfortable with my own company. It's the feeling of being forgotten, of being rendered invisible to the people who are supposed to see you most clearly. The silence in this apartment is a living thing. It breathes in the empty spaces on the sofa, settles in the dust motes dancing in the sunbeams, and sleeps in the empty chair at my dining table. It is a constant reminder of the space I no longer occupy in their lives. I stood up and walked over to the old cedar chest that sits at the foot of my bed. The scent of cedar and thyme wafted up as I lifted the heavy lid. It's where I keep the true heirlooms, the quilts made by hands long gone. My fingers brushed over the top one, my grandmother's masterpiece, a double wedding ring quilt, its interlocking circles stitched with a precision that bordered on miraculous. She made it for her own wedding, a symbol of love and union. I hadn't opened that chest in years, but suddenly, I knew the answer I was looking for was folded in the darkness, smelling of cedar and thyme. Unfolding it was like releasing a ghost. The colors were still vibrant, a testament to her care. I spread it out on my bed, the intricate pattern a marvel of artistry. Each circle was perfect, flowing into the next without a single flaw. This was not the work of a woman with a nice little hobby. This was the work of an artist, a master of her craft. This was the legacy they couldn't see, the value they couldn't comprehend. My grandmother had been a quiet, resilient woman, too. She had weathered storms I could only imagine, and she had poured her strength into this fabric. As I stood there, tracing the lines of her stitches, the phone rang again. My heart skipped a beat. It was Susan. Her voice was syrupy sweet, a tone she only used when she wanted something significant. "Helen, dear," she began. Mark and I were just talking. He mentioned he called you about those papers. We were just thinking that this old place is a lot for you to handle all on your own. All these stairs, the upkeep." The words were couched in concern, but the meaning was clear. They weren't just looking for a document. They were assessing my life, my home, and finding it wanting. The pressure I felt was immense, a physical weight on my chest. It was the Aspen text message all over again. But worse, this wasn't neglect. This was an invasion. They were circling, their pragmatic minds calculating the value of this property, the inconvenience of my presence in it. They saw an asset to be managed, a problem to be solved. They didn't see a home filled with a lifetime of memories. They didn't see the sanctuary where I had built my life back up after my husband passed, one stitch at a time. I looked around the room, at the life I had so carefully curated, the curtains my mother and I had quilted together, the runner on the dresser that I made the year Alex was born. These weren't just decorations. They were chapters of my story. The thought of Mark's cold, minimalist aesthetic replacing this warmth, of Susan packing my life's work into boxes labeled donations, sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. This was my ground, my last stand. The silence on the phone stretched on. I could hear Susan's faint, impatient sigh. She expected me to acquiesce, to be the sweet, agreeable old woman who didn't want to be a bother. That's who I had been for them for so long. The woman who hosted holidays she spent alone, who accepted flimsy excuses without complaint, who quietly nursed her own wounds so as not to trouble them with her pain. But looking at my grandmother's quilt, I felt a strength that wasn't just my own. It was hers and my mother's, a legacy of resilience woven into the very fabric of my being. The ghost of that Christmas dinner table flashed in my mind, the perfect turkey, the empty chairs, the sting of being so effortlessly discarded. That humiliation had simmered for a year, a low, quiet heat beneath the surface. Now, with Susan's cloying voice in my ear, it was coming to a boil. My silence had been mistaken for weakness, my patience for permission. The arthritis in my right hand throbbed, a sharp, fiery protest, but it felt different this time. It felt like a gathering of strength, a clenching of a fist. I took a deep breath, the air tasting of starch and defiance. I looked from my grandmother's quilt on the bed to the complex, unfinished pattern in my sewing hoop. It wasn't just a storm at sea anymore. In my mind's eye, I could see the final design, the intricate, unassailable structure of it. It wasn't just a quilt. It was a blueprint, my blueprint. I brought the phone back to my ear, the plastic cool against my skin. The meek, accommodating Helen Calloway was gone, stitched away into the past. My voice, when it came out, was calm and even, as steady and precise as my finest stitch. It did not waver. "Susan," I said, letting her name hang in the air for a moment, "I think we need to talk about my will, and about this building." The silence on the other end of the line was a physical thing, a heavy, crackling void where Susan's sugary platitudes used to be. I could hear the faint, sharp intake of her breath, a sound of pure shock. For a moment, I was just as stunned as she was. The words had come from my mouth, but they felt as if they belonged to someone else, a woman I hadn't met yet, someone forged in the quiet fire of that lonely Christmas Eve. The arthritis in my hand pulsed, not with pain, but with a strange, thrumming power. I had spent a year swallowing their excuses, and I had finally said something that couldn't be ignored. "Helen, what on earth are you talking about?" Susan's voice finally returned, stripped of its usual condescension, replaced with a thin, brittle edge. It was the voice of someone whose carefully laid plans had just hit a snag. "Your will? This building? That's a conversation for another time. We were just worried about you." The word worried was a lie, and we both knew it. It was a flimsy shield she was trying to raise, but I had already stepped past it. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "No, Susan," I said, my tone as even as a fresh seam. "I think the time is now." She mumbled something about needing to get Mark and hung up without another word. The click of the phone echoed in the sudden quiet of my apartment. I placed the receiver back in its cradle with a hand that was surprisingly steady. The air still smelled of cedar and old linen from the open chest. I looked at my grandmother's quilt, spread across the bed like a declaration of war. Its interlocking rings were a symbol of union, but to me, in that moment, they looked like shields. They were a testament to the strength of women who came before me. Women who knew how to hold things together when the world tried to pull them apart. My son called back less than 5 minutes later. There was no pretense in his voice this time. The brisk, all-business architect was on the line. "Mom, what was that about?" "You upset Susan." There was no concern, only accusation. He spoke as if I were a malfunctioning appliance, an unpredictable variable in one of his equations. He saw my sudden defiance not as a sign of my pain, but as an inconvenience to his life. The coldness in his tone was more clarifying than 1,000 empty apologies. It told me everything I needed to know about where I stood. I was no longer a mother. I was an obstacle. "I am talking about my future, Mark. And the future of this place," I said, looking around my living room. I saw not just old furniture, but the geography of my life. The spot on the floor where Alex took his first steps. The window where my husband, David, and I used to watch the ships come into the harbor. "You asked me to find the deed to this building. I did. I found quite a few things, actually. This was it. The moment the tide would turn. The air felt thick, heavy with unspoken history, and I was about to give it a voice. I walked back to the cedar chest, the phone pressed between my ear and shoulder. My fingers brushed against a worn leather portfolio tied with a faded ribbon. David's portfolio. He was a man of details, a man who believed in paper and ink, in permanence. Mark inherited his father's mind for structure, but not his heart for what those structures contained. Inside, beneath the main deed for the building, was a smaller, separate envelope, yellowed with age. On the front, in my husband's elegant script, it simply said, "For Helen, when the time is right." My heart hammered against my ribs. The time, it seemed, was now. "Mom, whatever you found, it's probably just old sentimental junk," Mark said, his impatience growing. "The city records are what matter. I just needed the parcel number as a courtesy." A courtesy? He made it sound like he was doing me a favor by involving me at all in the dismantling of my own life. I untied the ribbon on the envelope. Inside was not a letter, but a legal document, a trust addendum, signed and notarized 30 years ago, along with a short, handwritten note from David. My hands trembled as I read the familiar handwriting, the words a message from a ghost. "It seems you've underestimated my sentimentality, Mark, and your father's," I said, my voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name. It was grief and rage and a profound, soaring love all at once. The document was clear. When David had bought out the other original owners of this historic building, he had placed his majority shares not in his name, but in a trust of which I was the sole trustee and beneficiary upon his death. He hadn't just left me the apartment. He had left me the building. All of it. I wasn't a tenant. I was the landlord. The silence that followed was deeper and more profound than the one after my call with Susan. I could picture Mark perfectly, standing in his sterile, modern office, his blueprints for some glass tower spread out before him. I could see the confusion on his face, followed by the rapid calculations of a mind that saw the world in terms of assets and liabilities. He had looked at this building and seen a decaying property with a prime Charleston location. He had looked at his mother and seen a relic who was in the way. He had never once thought to look at the details. He had never considered the love story that was the foundation of this entire building. "That's not possible," he finally stammered. "The property taxes, the maintenance fees, they come from the estate. I manage the estate." His voice was tight with disbelief, the sound of a man whose perfect blueprint had just been torn in half. "Yes," I said calmly. "You've been managing the estate, and you've been using my money to pay the bills on my building. Thank you for taking care of that for me. Now, I think it's time I took a more active role in my own investments." The words felt incredible on my tongue. They were words of power, of ownership. He started to argue then, his voice rising. He threw legal terms at me, talked about probate and bylaws, trying to regain control through a barrage of jargon. He was trying to confuse me, to make me feel small and ignorant, the way he and Susan always had. He was telling me I didn't understand, that I was an old woman who was getting confused. "Mom, you're being emotional. Let me handle this. You don't know what you're doing." The condescension was back, sharp and desperate. It was his last weapon, and he wielded it without a second thought. But the spell was broken. His words no longer had the power to wound me. They were just noise, the desperate buzzing of a fly trapped against a window pane. I looked at the quilt on my bed, at the perfect, unyielding circles. My grandmother had faced hardships I could only dream of. She had raised a family through the Depression, buried a child, and worked her fingers to the bone. And she had done it all with a quiet, unshakable dignity. The idea that I would crumble in the face of my own son's bullying suddenly seemed ridiculous. My spine felt like it was made of steel. "I know exactly what I'm doing, Mark," I said, and my voice was so firm it startled even me. "I am protecting my home. I am honoring your father's wishes. He left this to me for a reason. He knew its value was more than just the land it sits on." I thought of David, of his quiet strength, his foresight. He had seen this coming, in a way. He had known that one day I might need a shield, and he had forged one for me out of paper and ink, leaving it for me to find when I was ready. For a moment, a wave of doubt washed over me. Could I really do this? I was 72 years old. My hands ached, and my world had become so small. He was an architect, a businessman. He knew this world of contracts and negotiations. I only knew the world of thread and fabric. The fight seemed so large, and I felt so tired. The loneliness of the past year pressed in on me, whispering that it would be easier to just give in, to let them have what they wanted, to buy myself a fragile peace. But then I looked at my own hands. Gnarled, yes. Aching, yes. But they were not weak. These hands had created beauty out of scraps. They had stitched together warmth and comfort. They knew how to take disparate, broken pieces and make them whole. They knew how to follow a complex pattern with patience and precision until a new creation emerged. This was no different. It was just a new kind of quilt, one made of legal papers and property deeds instead of cotton and silk. The pattern was just more complicated. The call ended with Mark sputtering threats about lawyers and family meetings. He was angry, cornered. He couldn't believe that his charming mother with her little hobby had a will of her own. He hung up on me, the ultimate act of dismissal. I stood there in the silence, the document from my husband clutched in my hand. The weight of it was immense. A responsibility I never asked for, but also a gift. It was a chance to redefine myself, not as their dependent, but as the architect of my own life. I knew I couldn't do this alone. Mark was right about one thing. He knew this world better than I did. But David had friends, loyal colleagues who respected him. I went to my old address book, its pages soft and worn. My finger traced down the list of names until I found it. Arthur Abernathy, David's lawyer and oldest friend. A man of quiet integrity, now semi-retired. I hadn't spoken to him since David's funeral, but I knew if anyone would help me, it would be Arthur. My hand trembled slightly as I dialed the number, a lifeline to the past and, I hoped, to my future. Arthur's voice was exactly as I remembered it, calm, kind, and carrying the gentle rhythm of a true Charlestonian. He was saddened to hear about the reason for my call, but not, I sensed, entirely surprised. He listened patiently as I explained everything. From the Christmas text message to the document I held in my hand. I didn't cry. I laid out the facts with a clarity that felt new and empowering. I wasn't just telling a story of being wronged. I was presenting a case. "Helen, I am so sorry you've been put through this," he said when I finished. "But I have to say, David would be incredibly proud of you right now. He always said you were the strongest person he knew." His words were a balm on the raw wound of the last year. He confirmed what I suspected. The trust was ironclad. The building was mine, unequivocally. He told me Mark had no legal standing to force a sale or make decisions without my explicit consent. I was in control. The relief was so immense it almost buckled my knees. It was one thing to believe it, to read it on a piece of paper. It was another to have it confirmed by someone who understood the law. Arthur offered to represent me, to handle all communication with Mark from now on. "You just tell me what you want to do, Helen," he said. "We'll make it happen." The question hung in the air after we hung up. What did I want to do? For the first time in a long time, the answer wasn't dictated by someone else's needs or schedule. I walked to the window and looked out at the city. I saw the church steeples, the old rooftops, and in the distance, the modern glass and steel buildings that were my son's legacy. He wanted to build towers that scraped the sky. He wanted to put his name on the future, and he was willing to erase his family's past to do it. He saw this building as a teardown, a relic to be cleared away for something new and profitable. He couldn't see the history, the stories held within its old brick walls. An idea began to form in my mind, quiet and tentative at first, then growing with a fierce, undeniable logic. What if I didn't just fight him to keep things as they were? What if I didn't just hold on to the past? What if I built the future myself? A different kind of future. One that honored the past instead of demolishing it. The storm at sea pattern in my sewing hoop caught my eye. It was a design of interlocking diamonds and triangles that created the illusion of waves, of movement, of chaos contained within a perfect, orderly structure. I thought about the art of quilting. It was about preservation, taking old, discarded fabrics and giving them new life, a new purpose. It was about creating a legacy that was both beautiful and useful, something that provided warmth and told a story. Why couldn't the same be done with a building? Why couldn't I take this structure, this piece of my family's history, and transform it into something that would last for generations? Not by tearing it down, but by building upon its foundation. The vision became clearer. It wasn't just about saving my apartment. It was about reimagining the entire building. A place that celebrated craftsmanship, that honored history. A place for artists, for creators. A place where things of beauty were made and cherished. A legacy not of cold steel and glass, but of warm brick and reclaimed wood. Of studios filled with light. Of a gallery on the ground floor showcasing the very kind of art my family had dismissed as a useless hobby. I picked up my needle and thread. The sharp point slid into the fabric with a satisfying little whisper. My hands moved with a renewed sense of purpose. Mark wanted to build a tower and put his name on it. Fine. I would build one too, but mine would be different. It would be a legacy built not on ambition and profit, but on resilience and love. I looked down at the intricate pattern taking shape under my fingers. This wasn't just a quilt anymore. It was a blueprint. And I, Helen Callaway, was the architect now. The first step felt like stepping off a cliff in the dark. Armed with Arthur's reassurances, I faced the cedar chest again, but this time I pulled out David's old metal file boxes. They were filled with a language I didn't speak. Amortization schedules, capital gains, property tax assessments. The neat columns of numbers swam before my eyes, mocking me. My world had been one of color, texture, and pattern. This was a world of cold, hard facts. I spent 3 days just sitting on the floor, surrounded by paper, the scent of old ink filling my nostrils, feeling the full, crushing weight of my own ignorance. I wasn't a businesswoman. I was a quilter who had stumbled into a boardroom. My first attempt at action was a disaster. I found a number for a roofing inspector in the local paper. a man with a friendly voice who promised a free estimate. He arrived, took one look at me and the old building, and I could see the calculation in his eyes. He walked the roof for 10 minutes and came back down with a grim face and a quote that made my blood run cold. It was an astronomical figure, padded with jargon about structural degradation and immediate replacement. He was counting on my fear and my naivete. It was a humiliating reminder that to the world, I was still just a fragile old woman, an easy mark. That night, I almost gave up. The fear was a physical thing, a tightness in my chest that made it hard to breathe. The voices of Mark and Susan were loud in my head, telling me I was in over my head, that I was being foolish and emotional. I sat in my rocking chair, the half-finished Storm at Sea quilt in my lap, and felt the storm raging inside me. My hands, which could command a needle with such precision, felt clumsy and useless. I cried for the first time since that Christmas Eve, not from loneliness, but from a profound sense of inadequacy. Maybe they were right. Maybe this was a battle I was never meant to fight. But the sun rises even after the worst storms. The next morning, I called Arthur, my voice trembling as I recounted the story of the inspector. He didn't scold me. He just listened. Then, with infinite patience, he began to teach me. He explained how to check a contractor's license, how to ask for line item quotes, how to get multiple bids. He became my guide, translating the foreign language of business into something I could understand. Our daily calls became my new routine. I would sit with my notebook, the phone cradled on my shoulder, scribbling notes until my arthritic fingers screamed in protest. I was going back to school at 72. My days found a new rhythm. The morning light no longer just illuminated my sewing. It fell across spreadsheets I'd printed out, their stark grids a new kind of pattern to master. I started taking David's old blueprints of the building and laying them out on the dining table, tracing the lines with my finger, learning the building's bones. I began to see it not just as my home, but as a living entity, with a circulatory system of plumbing and a skeleton of steel beams. The building had a history, and I was becoming its student, its archivist. My world was expanding beyond the four walls of my apartment. My quilting transformed alongside me. The Storm at Sea pattern felt wrong now, a relic of a past turmoil. I folded it carefully and put it away. I began a new project, something I designed myself. It was an abstract representation of the building's facade, using different textures and colors of fabric to represent the brick, the windows, the ironwork. It wasn't a traditional quilt. It was a study, a tactile blueprint. Stitching it helped me think, to organize the chaos of information in my head. Each stitch was a decision, a small act of bringing order to my new, complicated reality. I started walking through the building every evening, from the musty basement to the creaking attic. I introduced myself to the other tenants, people I had only ever nodded to in the hallway. I met Mrs. Gable in 2B, a retired music teacher whose faucet had been dripping for 6 months. I met the young couple in 3A who were expecting their first child and worried about the drafty windows. I listened to their stories, their frustrations with the neglect. They had seen Mark as an absentee landlord, and they saw me as just another part of the old, decaying structure. I knew I had to earn their trust, one conversation at a time. The internal battle was relentless. Some days, I would be filled with a clear, bright sense of purpose. On others, a wave of doubt would wash over me, so powerful it left me breathless. I would catch my reflection in a window and see only an old woman playing dress-up in a world she didn't belong to. Susan's dismissive laugh, Mark's impatient sighs. They were ghosts that haunted my quiet moments. The fear of failing, of making a fool of myself and proving them right, was a constant bitter taste in the back of my throat. Then came the first real shot across the bow. A thick envelope arrived by courier, containing a letter from Mark's lawyer. It was cold, formal, and brutal. It questioned my cognitive fitness to manage such a significant asset and spoke of initiating legal proceedings to have me declared incompetent. It was a declaration of war. My hands shook so badly I couldn't hold the paper steady. He wasn't just trying to take the building. He was trying to erase me, to legally classify me as the senile old woman he already believed me to be. The cruelty of it stole my breath. Arthur was my rock. He read the letter over the phone, his voice calm and steady in the face of my panic. "This is a scare tactic, Helen. It's what bullies do when they feel their power slipping," he said. He helped me draft a response, not with emotion, but with facts. We cited the trust documents, my legal standing, and the steps I was already taking to responsibly manage the property. Sending that letter back, signed with my own hand, felt like my first real act of defiance. It wasn't a quilt, it was a shield. The external conflicts weren't just legal. One afternoon, Mr. Henderson from the first floor stopped me in the lobby. His face was pinched with worry. "Helen, I've lived here for 30 years, he said, his voice trembling slightly. "I hear you're planning on turning this place into some artist's colony. What about us? Are you going to throw us all out on the street?" I realized then that Mark's war wasn't just being fought with lawyers. He was poisoning the well, spreading fear among my neighbors. His words, filtered through Mr. Henderson's genuine fear, hurt more than any legal threat. As if on cue, the building itself decided to test me. A torrential Charleston downpour revealed a massive leak in the roof, something Mark's negligent management had ignored for years. Water stained the ceiling in the top-floor hallway, dripping into buckets with a sad, rhythmic plink-plonk. The cost to repair it properly was staggering. It would consume a huge portion of the liquid assets in the trust, pushing my grander vision months, maybe years, down the road. It was a crisis, a moment where I could either fold or prove what kind of owner I was going to be. The decision was agonizing, but clear. I could do a cheap patch job, the kind Mark would have authorized, or I could do it right. I chose to do it right. I spent a week vetting roofing companies, armed with the knowledge Arthur had given me. I held a meeting in the lobby with all the tenants, the dripping buckets still in the hallway as evidence. I laid out the bids, explained the cost, and announced my decision to invest in a complete, guaranteed repair. I saw the surprise on their faces. Mr. Henderson looked at me with a new, appraising expression. I wasn't just talking about a vision. I was taking care of our home. That small victory gave me the courage to take the next step. Arthur introduced me to a young architect, a woman named Clara Vance. She had a passion for historical preservation. When I unrolled my fabric blueprint on her table, she didn't laugh. Her eyes lit up. "This is incredible, Mrs. Calloway," she said, tracing the lines of stitching. "You've captured the soul of the building." She understood. She saw my vision not as a foolish dream, but as a viable, beautiful concept. For the first time, I felt like I had a true ally. Together, Clara and I began to shape the dream into a concrete plan. She brought the technical expertise. I brought the history and the heart. We spent hours in my apartment, surrounded by her drawings and my fabric swatches. She taught me about load-bearing walls and zoning variances. I taught her about the way the afternoon light hits the third-floor landing. We were an unlikely team, a young woman at the start of her career and an old woman at the end of hers, both building something new. Clara suggested we apply for grants from the Charleston Preservation Society. The paperwork was a mountain. It required me to delve deep into the building's history, spending days at the city archives, my fingers dusty from sifting through century-old records. I discovered the original owner was a shipbuilder, a craftsman himself. I found old photographs of the building when it was new, its brick facade crisp and proud. I wasn't just trying to save a building. I was reclaiming a legacy of craftsmanship that had been forgotten. Months later, a letter arrived. It was from the Preservation Society. I opened it with trembling hands. We had been awarded our first grant. It wasn't enough to fund the whole project, not even close, but it was validation. It was a stamp of approval from the world outside, a confirmation that my idea had merit. I held the letter to my chest and allowed myself a moment of pure, unadulterated joy. We were on our way. The foundation was being laid, not with concrete, but with belief. My quilting became my diary through this process. I started a new, massive project. a quilt that told the story of the building, from the shipbuilder who laid the first brick to the future artists who would live within its walls. Each block was a chapter. There was a block for the leaky roof, stitched in shades of gray and silver thread that looked like water. There was a block for the day the grant was approved, a sunburst of brilliant gold and yellow. The quilt was a map of my journey, a testament to the transformation happening both outside and inside me. Susan tried to breach my walls one afternoon. She appeared at my door unannounced, holding a box from a fancy bakery. Her smile was as sweet and artificial as the icing on the croissants. She spoke of family healing and moving past misunderstandings. She wanted to know all about my little project, her questions slick with false curiosity. The old Helen would have invited her in, desperate for the crumbs of affection. The new Helen smiled politely, accepted the pastries, and kept the door chained. "Thank you for stopping by, Susan. I'm quite busy today," I said, and gently closed the door on her stunned face. A week later, Alex showed up. He stood awkwardly in my doorway, phone in his pocket for once, clearly sent on a reconnaissance mission by his parents. They just wanted me to see how you were doing," he mumbled, avoiding my eyes. I didn't press him. I simply invited him in for a glass of sweet tea. Clara's architectural model of the renovated building was on the dining table. Alex drifted towards it, his practiced indifference momentarily forgotten. "Is that a green roof?" he asked, pointing to the top. It was the first genuine question he'd asked me in years. It was a small thing, a tiny seed of connection, but it felt monumental. One evening, as I was working on the quilt, I realized the apartment was completely silent. It was a familiar silence, but it felt different. It was no longer the heavy, aching silence of loneliness. It was a peaceful, productive silence, filled not with absence, but with potential. I realized with a jolt that I hadn't thought about Mark or Susan all day. My mind had been consumed with budgets, blueprints, and fabric choices. Their absence was no longer a hole in my life. It was just empty space that I had filled with purpose. The final plans from Clara arrived on a Tuesday. I unrolled them across the table, the crisp paper smelling of ink and possibility. The Callaway Artisans, Residence. Seeing the name in print made it real. The design was breathtaking. It honored the building's historic soul while creating bright, modern spaces for artists to live and work. A gallery on the ground floor, studios with huge windows, a shared workshop in the basement, and a communal garden on the green roof Alex had noticed. It was more beautiful than I had ever dared to imagine. Signing the loan documents at the bank was the most terrifying and empowering moment of my life. Arthur sat beside me, his presence a quiet source of strength. My hand, the one that ached with arthritis every single morning, held the pen. As I signed my name, Helen Callaway, I wasn't just committing to a financial debt. I was signing a declaration of independence. I was formally taking control of my life, my home, and my future. The signature was a bit shaky, but it was mine. Mark called that night. It was his last, desperate gambit. His anger was gone, replaced by a weary, patronizing tone. "Mom, this has gone on long enough," he said. "Let's be reasonable. We'll buy you out. A generous offer. We can set you up in a beautiful new condo. No stairs, no worries. You can quilt all day and not have to deal with any of this." He still didn't see me. He saw a problem to be managed, a hobby to be placated. He was offering me a gilded cage, believing it was what I wanted. I let him finish. The silence stretched between us, no longer awkward, just final. "Thank you for the offer, Mark," I said, and my voice was calm, devoid of the anger and hurt that had fueled me for so long. "But I'm not looking for a place to quilt. I'm building something. A legacy. It's a lot like what you do, just with different materials. I thought you, of all people, would understand the satisfaction in that." There was nothing left for him to say. He didn't understand. And for the first time, I knew with absolute certainty that I no longer needed him to. After I hung up the phone, I stood by the window, looking out at the Charleston night. My reflection stared back at me from the dark glass. It was the face of a 72-year-old woman, etched with the lines of time. But the eyes were different. They weren't the sad, waiting eyes of the woman who had been left alone on Christmas. They were the eyes of an architect, a founder, a woman who had taken the scraps of her life and stitched them into a future. The storm had passed. I was the storm now. The day the scaffolding went up, it felt as if the building were finally showing its bones to the world. A skeleton of steel pipes wrapped around the old brick, a promise of the transformation to come. The noise was the first thing I had to get used to. The screech of saws, the rhythmic thud of hammers, the shouts of the construction crew echoing in the street. It was the antithesis of the quiet, lonely world I had inhabited for so long. But instead of grating on my nerves, the cacophony sounded like music. It was the sound of progress, the sound of a future being built, nail by nail and board by board. I made it my mission to be present every single day. I'd bring a large thermos of coffee for the crew in the morning, my gnarled hands surprisingly steady as I poured it into paper cups. The foreman, a burly man named Gus with a kind smile, initially treated me with a sort of gentle condescension, calling me ma'am and suggesting I stay inside where it was safe. But when I unrolled Clara's blueprints on a makeshift table and pointed to a discrepancy in the plumbing schematic, his attitude shifted. He started calling me boss. It was a small thing, but it felt like a crown. The change in the other tenants was gradual, but profound. Mrs. Gable from 2B, the retired music teacher, started leaving little pots of jam outside my door. Mr. Henderson, who had once accused me of trying to evict them, began to act as my unofficial lookout, reporting on the crew's progress and making sure no one left tools lying around. We were no longer just a collection of strangers living in a decaying building. We were a community, bound by the shared experience of dust, noise, and the exciting anticipation of what was to come. We were weathering the storm of renovation together. My apartment became the command center. Clara was there 3 times a week, her vibrant energy filling the space. We'd sit for hours amidst my stacks of fabric and her rolls of architectural drawings, the two worlds bleeding into one another. She would explain the complexities of historical window restoration, and I would show her how the color of a particular brick could be perfectly matched with a specific shade of ochre thread. We were speaking different languages, but we understood each other perfectly. We were both builders, creating something of permanence and beauty from raw materials. There were moments of doubt that ambushed me in the quiet of the night. Lying in bed, listening to the old building groan under the stress of its rebirth, I would feel a tremor of fear. The numbers on the loan documents would flash in my mind, a mountain of debt I had willingly shouldered. I was a 72-year-old woman with aching hands, overseeing a project that would have challenged a man half my age. The ghosts of Mark and Susan's voices would whisper that I was a fool, that I would fail and lose everything. But then the sun would rise, and I would smell the sawdust in the air, and the fear would recede. The contrast between my life now and my life a year ago was staggering. Before, my days were measured by the slow, methodical progress of a quilt. My world was the size of my sewing hoop. Now, my days were a whirlwind of decisions about wiring, flooring, and grant applications. My world had expanded to encompass an entire building, a construction crew, a team of architects, and a community of tenants. I was no longer waiting by the phone for a call that would never come. My phone rang constantly, and every call was about moving forward. I saw them once, during the thick of the renovation. I was on the sidewalk discussing a delivery with Gus when their sleek, silver car slowed to a crawl as it passed. Mark was driving, his hands tight on the wheel, his face a mask of disbelief and something that looked like anger. Susan was in the passenger seat, her mouth slightly agape, her perfectly manicured hand covering it as if to stifle a gasp. They stared at the bustling construction site, at me standing there with a hard hat on my head, looking not like a victim, but like a general commanding her army. They didn't stop. They just stared, and then sped away. That single moment was more validating than any legal victory. Their shock was a mirror reflecting my transformation. They had left a frail, lonely old woman behind, and in her place, they found a woman of substance and authority, the owner and architect of a world they couldn't control or even comprehend. The power they had held over me, the power to make me feel small and invisible with a single text message, had vanished. It had been replaced by the tangible power of a building permit and the unshakable strength of my own resolve. Alex came by a few weeks later, alone. He didn't make an excuse this time. He just said he wanted to see the progress. I walked him through the building, explaining the plans for the gallery, the studios, the rooftop garden. He listened, truly listened, his phone forgotten in his pocket. When we stood on the unfinished roof, looking out over the Charleston skyline, he turned to me. "Grandma," he said, his voice quiet, This is really cool." He finally saw me, not as an obligation or a relic, but as a person, as a builder. In that moment, I felt a stitch mending a tear that had been in my heart for years. The day the scaffolding came down was a celebration. It was like unwrapping a precious gift. The building stood revealed, its historic brick cleaned and repointed, its new windows gleaming in the afternoon sun. It was the same building, yet it was entirely new. It looked proud, resilient, a perfect blend of the past and the future. The tenants gathered on the sidewalk with me, a collective gasp of awe rippling through our small crowd. Mr. Henderson put a hand on my shoulder. "You did it, Helen," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You really did it." The grand opening of the Callaway Artisans' residence was on a warm spring evening, exactly 2 years after that silent Christmas Eve. The ground floor gallery was filled with light, music, and people. The walls were adorned with the first exhibition, my own quilts, not just the traditional ones, but the new architectural pieces I had created during the renovation. They hung like tapestries, telling the story of the buildings and my own transformation. People I didn't know, critics and art lovers, stood before them, discussing the patterns and the artistry. I stood in a quiet corner, watching it all unfold. I saw the new artist tenants, their faces bright with hope, talking about the studios upstairs. I saw Mrs. Gable chatting with Clara, her laughter echoing through the space. I saw Arthur raising a glass to me from across the room, his eyes twinkling. This was the family I had built, a family not of blood, but of shared purpose and mutual respect. The silence in my life had been replaced by a symphony of conversation, laughter, and community. My old life felt like a story about someone else. The woman who sat by the window, waiting, seemed like a distant ancestor. I was still a quilter, my hands still ached, but I was no longer defined by what had been taken from me. I was defined by what I had built. The intangible victory was the most profound. It wasn't about the money or the property. It was about reclaiming my own narrative. I had taken the scraps of a life they had discarded and stitched them into a masterpiece. I didn't hear from Mark or Susan. I read in a local business journal that his firm had lost the bid for a major downtown development project. There was no sense of triumph in it, only a quiet, sad acknowledgement of the different paths we had chosen. He was still chasing the sky, trying to build his legacy out of steel and glass, while I had found mine by digging my foundations deep into the history and the heart of the home he had been so willing to abandon. My personal reflection often comes in the early mornings, just as it always has. I still sit in my rocking chair by the window, but now my view is different. I look down into the courtyard garden, where the first tenants are planting herbs. I see the lights flick on in the studios across the way as artists begin their day's work. The building is alive, breathing with the creative energy of the people it now shelters. It is a living quilt, each resident a unique patch of fabric, all held together by the strong, invisible threads of community. The journey was the hardest thing I have ever done. It forced me to face my deepest fears, my ignorance, and my grief. It taught me that strength isn't the absence of weakness, but the courage to act in spite of it. I learned that a 72-year-old hand, though gnarled with arthritis, can sign a contract, approve a blueprint, and build a future just as surely as it can guide a needle and thread. My hands are still a map of my life, but now they tell a new story. The final piece of the gallery exhibition is the quilt I started that day, the blueprint of the building's facade. It hangs in the most prominent spot, right by the entrance. It's not the most technically perfect piece I've ever made. Some of the stitches are a little uneven, a testament to the days when my hands shook with fear or exhaustion. But it is the most honest thing I have ever created. It is a story of how a home becomes more than just walls, and how a hobby can become a legacy. I've learned that being left behind can be a strange and terrible gift. It can either be the end of your story, or it can be the moment you are forced to pick up the pen and write the next chapter yourself. The silence they left me with became the canvas on which I painted my new life. Their dismissal of my art, my useless hobby, became the very tool I used to rebuild my world. They thought they were closing a door on me, but they only opened a gate to a future I never would have had the courage to imagine for myself. My hands find their work. Even now, I am working on a new quilt for my grandson, Alex. It's a complex pattern, a constellation of stars. Each star represents a person in the residence, a point of light in our shared sky. He visits every Sunday now, not out of obligation, but because he wants to. He helps me in the rooftop garden and asks about the artists. He is learning that value cannot always be measured in square footage or resale prices. Sometimes, its true measure is in the warmth it provides. To anyone who has ever been made to feel small, invisible, or left behind, I want to say this. Do not let their definition of you become your reality. Your worth is not determined by the space you occupy in someone else's life, but by the world you build for yourself. The tools you need are already in your hands. They may be skills that others have dismissed as quaint or unimportant, but they are yours. They are the threads of your own resilience. Look at the scraps you've been given, the disappointments, the heartbreaks, the lonely nights. Do not see them as remnants of a life that is over. See them as the raw materials for your greatest creation. There is an architecture to resilience, a pattern to be found in pain. Your legacy is not something you leave behind when you are gone. It is something you build. Every single day you choose to pick up your needle and make the next stitch. My name is Helen Callaway. I am a quilter, and I am an architect. I learned that the two are not so different. Both require a clear vision, a steady hand, and the unwavering belief that you can take disparate pieces and stitch them together to create something strong, beautiful, and whole. Something that will not only shelter you, but will stand long after you are gone. A testament to the fact that you were here and that you built something that mattered. The greatest lesson has been this. You cannot control whether others will see your value, but you can, and you must, decide to value yourself. My family saw me as a relic, a piece of the past to be managed. They were wrong. The past is not a place to live. It is a foundation upon which to build, and it is never, ever too late to begin construction. The most beautiful patterns are often the ones we create after the fabric of our lives has been torn. I no longer watch the ships in the harbor with a sense of longing for a world that has sailed on without me. I now see them as a reminder that we are all vessels on our own journey. Some storms are meant to wreck us, to drive us into the rocks, but other storms are meant to be navigated, to test the strength of our hull, and to push us toward a shore we never knew we were destined to find. I found my shore. It is here, within these walls, in this community, in the quiet, powerful hum of a life I built myself.